tonight. We drift back to a time before written memory, before human history truly begins, guided only by the oldest words ever pressed into clay. Somewhere around 5,000 years ago, perhaps a bit more, scribes in the land between two rivers took sharpened reeds and pushed them into wet tablets, creating wedge-shaped marks that would outlast empires, religions, and entire civilizations. And among these earliest inscriptions, scattered across temple archives and palace libraries, we find references to beings called the Anunnaki, a name that translates roughly to those who from heaven came down, or perhaps princely offspring, depending on which philologist you ask and how much coffee they've consumed that particular afternoon. And these references describe not merely gods in some abstract theological sense, but actual entities who arrived, who descended, who touched the earth, and began doing what any sensible visitors might do upon arriving somewhere new. They started building things and complaining about the workload. The ancient Sumerians, you see, were meticulous record keepers, obsessively documenting everything from grain shipments to divine genealogies with equal bureaucratic enthusiasm. And within their texts we find the Anunnaki portrayed as a council of deities, sometimes numbering 50, sometimes 300, sometimes 7, who apparently made all the important decisions while the rest presumably attended meetings and pretended to take notes. And these beings reportedly established the very first cities, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and occasionally got into spectacular family arguments that made Greek mythology look like a polite dinner party. So if you're settling in tonight hoping for a gentle story about ancient religion, well, you probably won't survive this, at least not without encountering some genuinely strange ideas along the way, because the Anunnaki have attracted interpretations, ranging from perfectly respectable academic analysis to theories that would make your most conspiracy-minded relative look positively conventional. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because there's something rather lovely about building a community of people who appreciate drifting off to stories about ancient astronauts and irritable Mesopotamian deities. And speaking of community, I'd love to hear from you in the comments about where you're listening from tonight, and what time the clock reads on your wall, whether you're curled up in some apartment in Tokyo watching rain streak the windows, or perhaps wrapped in blankets somewhere in Scotland while the wind howls outside, or maybe lying in a hammock in Brazil counting stars between palm fronds. Wherever you are, you're joining thousands of others in this strange nightly ritual of learning something ancient before sleep takes us. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, back through the millennia, to a world where the sky was closer, the gods walked among mortals, and everything smelled vaguely of sheep, because honestly, everything in ancient Mesopotamia smelled vaguely of sheep. Picture yourself approaching the city of Eridu, considered by the Sumerians themselves to be the very first city ever founded, rising from the marshlands of southern Iraq like a dream of permanence amid reeds and water. And the temple there, dedicated to the water god Enki, stands as humanity's earliest known attempt at monumental religious architecture, its mud brick walls catching the dawn light in shades of amber and gold, while priests move through shadowed corridors carrying offerings of fish and beer. And this is where our story properly begins, because the texts found in Eridu and its sister cities contain what scholars call the Sumerian king list, a remarkable document that traces royal lineage backward through time with alarming precision until it reaches a point where it casually mentions that kingship descended from heaven, not metaphorically, not poetically, but as a straightforward historical statement delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone one might use. To note that Tuesday follows Monday. The mainstream historical interpretation holds that these references to heavenly descent represent theological metaphor, a way of legitimizing royal authority by connecting earthly rulers to divine mandate. And this interpretation makes considerable sense given what we know about ancient propaganda and the universal human tendency to claim that whoever happens to be in charge was put there by cosmic forces rather than, say, being particularly good at hitting people with bronze weapons. But the texts themselves resist such easy categorization, describing the Anunnaki with physical characteristics, personal preferences, interpersonal conflicts, and even dietary habits that seem oddly specific for mere metaphorical constructs, as if someone decided to invent abstract theological concepts and then gave them a preference for barley beer over date wine. Here is where our first genuine Sumerian historical fact enters the narrative, documented and accepted by mainstream archaeology. The Sumerians did not emerge gradually from local populations. but appeared relatively suddenly in the historical record, around 4500 BCE, bringing with them a language that belongs to no known language family, technologies that seemed remarkably advanced for their time, and a civilization so fully formed that it has puzzled scholars for over a century, leading the great Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer to famously declare that history begins at Sumer. And while some researchers have since questioned whether that declaration goes too far, the basic mystery remains: where exactly did these people come from, and how did they know so much so quickly? The temples they built, called ziggurats, rose in stepped pyramidal forms toward the heavens, and archaeological evidence suggests these structures were designed specifically to serve as meeting places between earthly and divine realms, complete with chambers at the top, furnished as bedrooms for visiting deities, who apparently appreciated thread counts and comfortable mattresses, despite being immortal beings of cosmic power, which raises the delightful question of why exactly a god would need a nap. Now we arrive at our first quirky interpretation, and I should warn you that this one comes from the fringes of respectable discourse. But bedtime is precisely the right time for considering ideas that sunlight might embarrass. So here we go. Author Zecharia Sitchin, whose 1976 book, The 12th Planet, launched an entire alternative history movement, proposed that the Anunnaki were not metaphorical deities at all, but actual extraterrestrial beings who arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago from a planet called Nibiru, which supposedly orbits our Sun in a massive elliptical path that brings it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years. And while mainstream astronomers have found zero evidence for this planet, and linguists have thoroughly debunked Sitchin's translations of ancient texts, his ideas persist in popular culture with the resilience of a particularly stubborn houseplant, thriving in conditions that should by all rights kill them. The scholarly debate surrounding early Sumerian religion is genuinely fascinating, even without invoking extraterrestrial visitors, because academics continue to argue about fundamental questions, like whether the Anunnaki were originally chthonic deities associated with the underworld, as some evidence suggests, or celestial beings connected to astronomical phenomena, or perhaps ancestor spirits elevated to divine status through centuries of veneration. And the frustrating truth is that we may never know for certain, because the Sumerians themselves may not have maintained perfectly consistent theological views over the 1,000+ years their civilization flourished, rather like how modern religious traditions contain internal contradictions that believers comfortably hold in tension without feeling any particular need to resolve them. The evening breeze carries the scent of river water and cooking fires as we settle deeper into ancient Eridu, watching torchlight flicker across temple walls painted with images of fish-tailed figures and winged discs, symbols that would echo through millennia of Mesopotamian art, like visual earworms you can't quite shake, and somewhere a priest is chanting in a language that would remain unreadable until Victorian-era scholars cracked its secrets, his voice rising and falling in patterns designed to please beings who may or may not have been listening from their heavenly abode. And if this seems like a lot of effort to expend on possibly fictional entities, well, I invite you to consider how much effort modern humans expend on professional sports teams, which are definitely fictional in the sense that their existence is entirely contingent on collective agreement, and yet inspire genuine emotional investment that occasionally leads to property damage. The clay tablets recovered from sites like Nippur, Aram, and ancient Babylon contain references to the Anunnaki that span thousands of years, suggesting these beings held genuine importance in Mesopotamian thought, rather than representing some passing theological fad, and the consistency of certain details across different periods and cities hints at an underlying tradition that scribes felt obligated to preserve accurately, as if they were documenting historical events rather than simply elaborating creative mythology. Though of course the alternative explanation is simply that ancient scribes were no less prone to copying each other's homework than modern students, and once a good story gets established, it tends to replicate across cultures like a particularly infectious meme. The question of why the Anunnaki came to Earth, according to the ancient texts, leads us into territory that sounds suspiciously like a corporate restructuring gone wrong, because the Sumerian creation myths describe a situation where the junior gods, those Anunnaki assigned to physical labor, eventually went on what we might today call a wildcat strike, refusing to continue the back-breaking work of digging canals and mining precious materials. And this labor dispute among divine beings apparently prompted the senior deities to convene an emergency management meeting, during which someone suggested that perhaps they could create a new species specifically designed to do the tedious work nobody else wanted to handle, which, if you think about it, represents history's first documented instance of outsourcing, and suggests that even beings of cosmic power couldn't escape the fundamental truth that nobody actually wants to dig irrigation ditches. The Atrahasis epic, one of our primary sources for this creation narrative, describes how the god Enki proposed mixing divine essence with clay to fashion human beings, specifically using the blood of a slaughtered god named Geshtui, who apparently drew the short straw in this particular cosmic lottery, and the resulting creatures were called Lulu, meaning something like mixed ones or primitives, designed to bear the burden of labor and free the Anunnaki for more elevated pursuits like ruling, judging, and presumably arguing about whose turn it was to use the good chariot. This creation story represents one of our genuine mainstream historical facts for this section. Scholars widely acknowledge that the Sumerian understanding of human origins centered on the idea that humanity was created specifically to serve the gods, a theological framework that profoundly influenced later Mesopotamian civilizations and may have contributed elements to the creation narratives found in other ancient Near Eastern traditions, including certain aspects of the Hebrew Bible, though tracing these influences requires careful scholarly work and not the sort of wild speculation that makes tenure committees nervous. The practical purpose assigned to humanity in these texts, essentially functioning as a divine workforce, might strike modern ears as rather unflattering, but we should remember that ancient peoples did not necessarily share our contemporary assumptions about human dignity and cosmic significance. They lived in a world where survival required constant labor, where drought and flood could destroy everything, and where the universe seemed governed by forces vastly more powerful than any human agency. So the idea that powerful beings might have created humanity to serve specific functions probably felt less degrading than simply realistic. Now the texts become more specific about what exactly the Anunnaki needed so desperately that they would create an entirely new species to obtain it, and here we encounter the famous references to gold, that gleaming metal that would obsess humanity for the next several millennia, and still prompts perfectly rational people to make questionable financial decisions. Because according to certain interpretations of the ancient tablets, the Anunnaki required gold in massive quantities, possibly for technological purposes that the Sumerians themselves did not fully understand, but recorded faithfully anyway, rather like how a medieval peasant might describe a knight's activities without comprehending the metallurgical principles underlying armor construction. Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation, and here we arrive at our quirky fringe material for this section, proposed that the Anunnaki needed gold to repair the damaged atmosphere of their home planet Nibiru, a hypothesis that mainstream scientists find approximately as plausible as using cheese to repair submarine hulls, but which has gained remarkable traction among certain communities, who presumably find conventional archaeology insufficiently exciting. And while Sitchin's linguistic methodology has been repeatedly demolished by actual experts in Sumerian, his narrative has undeniable dramatic appeal, featuring as it does interplanetary environmental crisis, genetic engineering, and family drama among immortal aliens. The city of Ur, whose ruins still rise from the Iraqi desert like the skeleton of a dream, contained libraries where scribes copied and preserved these creation narratives across generations, and archaeologists excavating the site in the early 20th century uncovered not only the famous royal tombs with their grisly evidence of human sacrifice, but also thousands of cuneiform tablets that continue to yield new insights as scholars slowly work through the backlog, because it turns out that 5,000 years of record-keeping produces quite a lot of reading material, and graduate students continue paying the price. The scholarly debate surrounding Sumerian creation narratives focuses partly on questions of dating and influence. Did these stories emerge from older oral traditions that might stretch back even further into prehistory? Or were they literary creations of the early dynastic period, designed to serve specific political and religious purposes? And the answer appears to be yes to both, with layers of tradition accumulating like sediment over centuries, until separating original kernels from later elaborations becomes essentially impossible, rather like trying to identify the original joke that spawned 1,000 internet variations. Imagine yourself now in one of those ancient scriptoriums, the air thick with the smell of drying clay, and the quiet scratching of reed styluses, where young scribes learned their craft by copying and recopying texts that their teachers had learned from their teachers, extending backward through time in an unbroken chain of transmission that would eventually bridge millennia and deliver these stories to modern readers who access them through glowing screens, while eating snacks that would have seemed miraculous to any ancient Sumerian. Though honest, they might be more impressed by reliable indoor plumbing. The creation of humanity, as described in these texts, did not happen all at once, but involved considerable trial and error, with early prototypes emerging flawed or incomplete before the gods finally perfected their technique. And this detail carries a strange resonance for anyone familiar with modern debates about genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, because it suggests that even divine beings had to iterate their way towards success rather than achieving perfection immediately, which either humanizes the gods or simply reflects the thoroughly human experience of the scribes who recorded these stories while presumably making plenty of their own mistakes. The temples where these narratives were recited during religious festivals featured elaborate rituals designed to maintain the relationship between humanity and the Anunnaki, offerings of food and drink presented to cult statues that were treated as literal embodiments of divine presence rather than mere representations, and the care lavished on these statues, clothing them, bathing them, offering them meals that priests would later consume, since someone had to eat all that perfectly good food, reveals a conception of the divine that differs markedly from later abstract monotheism. These were gods you could see, touch, and apparently occasionally disappoint, judging by the apologetic tone of certain ritual texts. The question of human purpose, established so definitively in these ancient creation myths, would echo through subsequent philosophical and religious traditions, sometimes explicitly rejected, sometimes unconsciously perpetuated, and the Sumerian answer, that we exist to serve powers greater than ourselves, remains one of several competing frameworks that humans have developed to explain their presence in the cosmos, alongside alternatives like random chance, divine love, cosmic necessity, and the uncomfortable possibility that the question itself might be meaningless, though that last option rarely makes for good bedtime listening. The Anunnaki, having created their workforce, now faced the challenge of managing their new species, and the texts suggest this proved more complicated than anticipated, because humans turned out to have their own desires, made their own noise, and generally proved less tractable than the gods had apparently hoped. Rather like how anyone who has ever adopted a pet expecting peaceful companionship has eventually found themselves cleaning up unexpected messes at inconvenient hours. The canals that irrigated Mesopotamian fields required constant maintenance. The floods that enriched the soil also destroyed settlements, and the agricultural surplus that enabled civilization also enabled population growth that created new demands. And through it all, the Anunnaki reportedly supervised, intervened, and occasionally lost their tempers in ways that would prove catastrophic for their human creations, because immortal beings with vast power are not necessarily immortal beings with vast patience, as any parent of multiple children could have predicted. The starlight falling on those ancient temples fell on a world that understood itself as fundamentally connected to realms beyond ordinary perception, where the boundary between heaven and earth remained permeable, where gods walked among mortals in ways that modern secular consciousness struggles to imagine, and whether we interpret these beliefs as primitive superstition, sophisticated metaphor, or accurate reporting of genuinely experienced phenomena, probably depends as much on our own assumptions as on any evidence the ancient texts provide. The Sumerian king list announces, with the casual confidence of someone stating that water is wet, that kingship descended from heaven, and this simple declaration opens vast territories of interpretation, where mainstream scholars and fringe theorists meet like armies at a border. Neither can definitively claim, because the list proceeds to name kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years each before the Great Flood, followed by monarchs with progressively more reasonable reign lengths afterward, as if whatever mechanism had been granting extraordinary longevity suffered water damage and never quite worked properly again. This document, compiled during the early 2nd millennia BCE from older sources that may stretch back centuries earlier, served obvious political purposes, legitimizing contemporary dynasties by connecting them to primordial divine authority, but the specific details it contains tantalize researchers who wonder whether purely fictional propaganda would include such precise numbers, as if the scribes felt constrained by some earlier tradition. They dared not contradict even while shaping the narrative for current needs, rather like how modern politicians must work around inconvenient historical facts while spinning everything else. The first city where kingship alighted, according to this tradition, was Eridu, already ancient by the time these texts were compiled, and archaeological excavations at the site have revealed continuous occupation stretching back to around 5400 BCE, with temple structures rebuilt repeatedly on the same sacred spot through multiple architectural phases, each layer containing artifacts that speak to increasingly sophisticated religious practice, as if something about that particular location demanded veneration across millennia, regardless of who happened to be venerating at any given moment, which either reflects deep cultural continuity or suggests the ancient Sumerians were no better at resisting sunk cost fallacy than we are. Here enters our mainstream historical fact for this section. The institution of kingship in ancient Sumer evolved from earlier forms of collective governance, with archaeological and textual evidence suggesting that the earliest Sumerian cities were ruled by councils of elders and assemblies of citizens, before power gradually concentrated in the hands of individual rulers, a transition that the Sumerians themselves explained through mythology, by claiming that the gods granted supreme authority to specific individuals during times of crisis, essentially arguing that dictatorship was a divine innovation rather than a human power grab, which is exactly the sort of thing dictators would say if they had access to good spin doctors. The cities that received kingship after Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, each flourished under the patronage of specific Anunnaki, who apparently treated their assigned territories with varying degrees of attention and competence. Much like middle managers distributed across corporate branch offices, some genuinely invested in their roles, and others clearly counting the days until transfer to a better posting. Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki Council, ruled from Nippur, which served as a kind of divine administrative capital, where major decisions affecting humanity were supposedly made, and the temples there received offerings from across Sumer, tribute paid to the ultimate authority in a heavenly bureaucracy that apparently operated on principles recognizable to anyone who has ever dealt with large organizations, chains of command, jurisdictional disputes, and occasional catastrophic miscommunication. The scholarly debate relevant to this section concerns the relationship between religious authority and political power in early Mesopotamia, with some researchers arguing that priests originally held supreme power and only gradually ceded authority to secular kings, while others contend that military leaders always held ultimate authority but found it convenient to clothe their power in religious justification, and still others suggest the categories themselves may be anachronistic, imposed by modern minds on ancient realities that organized authority differently than we do, which is the sort of answer that makes students groan, but genuinely reflects the messy truth that the past was not organized for our analytical convenience. Our quirky interpretation for this section comes from researcher Michael Tellinger, who has proposed that the Anunnaki established sophisticated mining operations in what is now South Africa, pointing to mysterious circular stone structures he calls Adam's calendar as evidence of their presence, and while geologists and archaeologists remain thoroughly unconvinced by his claims, preferring explanations involving indigenous African peoples and natural geological processes, his theory has attracted considerable popular interest, possibly because it offers the appealing narrative that Africa held cosmic significance long before European colonizers arrived to claim otherwise, though this silver lining does not make the underlying claims more accurate. The city of Ur, gleaming on the Euphrates, rose to prominence during the 3rd millennium BCE under rulers who claimed divine favor from the moon god Nana, and the famous ziggurat, that still partially stands there, once supported a temple complex that served as both religious center and economic hub, because ancient temples functioned as corporations, banks, and governments rolled into one, managing agricultural estates, conducting international trade, and employing substantial portions of the urban population in ways that blur modern categories between sacred and secular, between prophet and prophecy. The Anunnaki supposedly watched over these developments with interest, intervening when necessary to correct human errors or punish human presumption, and the text describe various instances where divine displeasure manifested as plague, drought, or military defeat, a theological framework that explains suffering without questioning divine benevolence, since clearly humans must have done something wrong to deserve punishment, a logic that unfortunately remains operational in some circles today despite its evident limitations. The daily life unfolding beneath these cosmic dramas involved farmers waking before dawn to tend irrigation channels, merchants negotiating deals in covered marketplaces, children playing games whose rules we can only guess at from scattered archaeological fragments, and slaves for Mesopotamian civilization ran on slave labor, performing the countless tasks that kept complex societies functioning, all presumably unaware or unconcerned that their activities might be monitored by beings from another realm, rather like how modern office workers rarely contemplate the surveillance systems recording their every keystroke. The astronomical knowledge displayed by Mesopotamian priests suggests systematic observation continued over centuries, tracking the movements of planets they associated with specific Anunnaki, the morning star Venus with Inanna, mighty Jupiter with Marduk, and whether this association arose because the gods inhabited these planets, or because the gods were the planets perceived as divine, or because the priests simply found astronomical patterns useful for organizing ritual calendars, remains unclear from texts that did not share our modern anxiety about distinguishing metaphor from literal description. The royal inscriptions found throughout Mesopotamia reveal kings constantly invoking divine authority, claiming that the gods themselves had chosen them to rule, fought alongside them in battle, and approved their construction projects, language that served obvious propaganda purposes, but may also reflect genuine belief, because leaders who justify their power through divine mandate often come to believe their own rhetoric, a phenomenon observable throughout history, wherever ambition meets convenient theology. The evening winds carry dust from the Arabian desert across the irrigated fields of Sumer, dust that settled on ziggurat steps and filled the lungs of priests chanting prayers to Anunnaki, who may have been listening, may have been fictional, or may have been something we lack the conceptual categories to properly understand, and the uncertainty itself tells us something important about human experience. We have always sensed presences beyond our understanding, always constructed narratives to explain those sensings, and whether those narratives capture truth or merely console us remains perhaps the oldest question. The kingship would move from city to city over millennia, never permanently settling, as if the gods enjoyed rearranging the political geography to prevent any single location from claiming permanent primacy, or perhaps simply reflecting the practical reality that alluvial landscapes shift, rivers change course, and what was strategic high ground in one generation becomes vulnerable floodplain in the next, divine planning being indistinguishable from geological contingency if you squint appropriately. The flood that supposedly destroyed the world and ended the antediluvian age of impossibly long-reigned kings survives in Mesopotamian literature as a trauma remembered across millennia, a catastrophe so total that the scribes who recorded it clearly believed they were documenting the most significant event in cosmic history, the moment when the Anunnaki Council decided humanity had become intolerable and voted, with one notable dissent, to wipe the slate clean through waters that would cover the highest mountains and drown every living thing that breathed. The tale reaches us through multiple versions, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, each adding details, adjusting emphases, but maintaining core elements that parallel the later biblical flood narrative so closely that 19th century scholars who first deciphered these tablets experienced genuine existential vertigo, finding stories they had learned as sacred scripture appearing in texts written centuries earlier by pagans who worshipped multiple gods and sacrificed sheep to statues, which either proves that the flood actually happened and was remembered by all surviving cultures, or that good stories travel easily between traditions, or possibly both. The god Enlil, chief executive of the Anunnaki Council, apparently found humanity's noise intolerable. The texts literally say we were too loud, keeping the gods awake with our constant clamor. And this complaint has generated considerable scholarly discussion about what exactly the Sumerians meant by noise, whether literal acoustic disturbance, metaphorical reference to human sinfulness, or perhaps euphemism for overpopulation and its attendant problems, because gods suffering insomnia from human rowdiness seems almost too mundane a motivation for genocide, like destroying an ant colony because you find their tiny footsteps irritating. Here we encounter our mainstream historical fact for this section. Geologists and archaeologists have documented evidence of substantial flooding events in Mesopotamia, including flood deposits at multiple sites that suggest periodic catastrophic inundations consistent with the region's hydrology. And while none of these local floods approached the scale described in mythology, they may have provided the experiential basis for narratives that subsequent generations elaborated into cosmic proportions, transforming remembered disaster into mythological explanation for why the world seems different from earlier times, rather like how personal traumas grow larger in memory until they feel like they shaped everything. The god Enki, perpetual troublemaker among the Anunnaki, and apparent friend to humanity, refused to let the planned extinction proceed without interference, so he spoke to the wall of a reed house, knowing that the man Ziusudra, called Utnapishtim in later Babylonian versions, and obviously prefiguring Noah, was listening on the other side, a clever legalistic dodge that technically honored his oath not to warn any human, while practically ensuring human survival, the sort of divine loophole exploitation that suggests even cosmic beings appreciate a good technicality. The boat that Ziusudra built, following Enki's indirect instructions, supposedly contained representatives of all animal species along with craftsmen skilled in various necessary arts, ensuring that post-flood civilization could rebuild rather than starting entirely from scratch, and the logistics of this project have generated endless calculations about hull dimensions, carrying capacity, feeding schedules, and waste management that miss the mythological point, while providing entertainment for people who enjoy impossible engineering problems, rather like calculating the aerodynamics of Santa's sleigh or the caloric requirements of hibernating dragons. The scholarly debate surrounding Mesopotamian flood narratives focuses partly on transmission. How did these stories pass from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian tradition, and then apparently influence Hebrew versions recorded centuries later? And the answers reveal complex cultural interactions along trade routes and through imperial conquests, with scribes copying, adapting, and sometimes deliberately modifying texts to serve new theological purposes, proving that intellectual property concerns are considerably older than modern copyright law. Our quirky interpretation for this section involves the persistent claim, found across various alternative history circles, that the flood was not merely a natural disaster permitted by the gods, but an actual deliberate act, using advanced technology, perhaps involving the melting of Antarctic ice sheets, the manipulation of tidal forces, or the deployment of weapons beyond our current understanding, theories that provide satisfying narratives for people who prefer cosmic drama to the more prosaic reality that river valleys flood. Ancient peoples remembered big floods, and storytellers do what storytellers always do, which is make everything bigger and more meaningful than mundane reality warrants. The waters rose, according to the texts, for 7 days, covering everything, while the Anunnaki themselves fled upward, cowering at the edge of heaven, like frightened dogs, as the destruction they had authorized exceeded even their expectations. And this detail carries genuine emotional weight, gods who authorized genocide finding themselves overwhelmed by its actual execution, regretting their decision as the screams of drowning humanity reached even celestial heights. A moment of divine remorse that complicates any simple reading of the Anunnaki as either benevolent guides or malevolent overlords. When the waters finally receded and Ziusudra's boat grounded on a mountain, the traditions vary about which mountain, with candidates including Mount Nisir in modern Kurdistan and the more famous Ararat of biblical tradition. The survivor offered sacrifice to the gods, roasting meat whose savor rose toward heaven, where the Anunnaki, who apparently had been fasting during the flood, gathered around the offering like flies around a honey pot. The text actually uses that simile, suggesting that cosmic beings experienced hunger and found the smell of burnt offerings irresistible, which either humanizes the divine or simply reflects the thoroughly human concerns of scribes, who knew perfectly well what sacrifice smelled like. The aftermath brought the Anunnaki Council into conflict with Enlil, who remained angry that any human had survived his carefully planned extinction, while Enki defended his action and the others gradually came around to accepting that humanity served useful purposes worth preserving. A divine policy debate that reads like corporate management reviewing a failed initiative and deciding to pretend it was actually successful. Lessons learned. Let's move forward positively. The kingship that descended again after the flood settled first in Kish, according to the Sumerian king list, and the reign lengths of post-Diluvian monarchs dropped dramatically, from tens of thousands of years to merely hundreds, then to numbers that start approaching historical plausibility, as if whatever mechanism had sustained antediluvian longevity had been permanently damaged by the cataclysm, or perhaps as if the scribes grew embarrassed by earlier exaggerations and gradually returned to reality, a literary retreat from fantasy that later ages would reverse with enthusiasm. The cities rebuilt, the temples rose again, the irrigation systems were restored by workers who may have been descendants of those Ziusudra saved, or may have been entirely new creations. The texts are unclear on this point, and scholars continue arguing about whether the flood myth implies complete human extinction, except for the ark's passengers, or merely localized devastation that later tradition universalized, a question that matters theologically but probably mattered less to ancient listeners, more concerned with the narrative's emotional and explanatory power than its logical consistency. The memory of the flood would haunt Mesopotamian consciousness for millennia, appearing in ritual texts, magical incantations, and literary references that assume audience familiarity with the basic story, rather like how modern Western literature assumes readers know about Adam and Eve without requiring fresh exposition each time the garden gets mentioned. cultural literacy building on shared mythological foundations that once seemed universal and now require footnotes for readers whose foundations differ. The night deepens over ancient Babylon, where the flood traditions reached their most elaborate literary expression in the Gilgamesh epic, that masterpiece of world literature, where the hero travels to the ends of the earth, seeking immortality, and finds instead Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, who cannot grant what he was given by divine favor, leaving Gilgamesh to return home, understanding that the only immortality available to mortals comes through deeds remembered, wisdom shared, walls built to outlast their builders, a conclusion that remains relevant tonight, as we ourselves seek meaning in stories older than any living memory. The clay tablets that preserve these ancient narratives continue to emerge from museum storage and archaeological excavations, each new text potentially adding details that might confirm, complicate, or contradict what we thought we understood. And this ongoing process of discovery reminds us that our picture of the Anunnaki remains incomplete, a puzzle with many pieces still missing, and others perhaps lost forever to time's indifferent erosion. What are we to make tonight of these beings who supposedly descended from heaven, created humanity as a labor force, established the first cities, quarreled among themselves, nearly destroyed their creations in a fit of divine irritation, and then stepped back to let human history proceed with only occasional interventions? The mainstream scholarly position holds that the Anunnaki represent theological constructs, projections of human social structures onto cosmic reality, with their hierarchies, conflicts, and concerns, reflecting those of the Sumerian priests and kings who developed and maintained their worship. This interpretation makes considerable sense, and comfortably fits within academic frameworks that approach ancient religion as human cultural production rather than divine revelation. Yet something in these old stories resists complete reduction, maintains its capacity to intrigue and unsettle, perhaps because the Sumerians themselves seem to have experienced their gods as genuinely present, not as comfortable metaphors but as living realities with whom relationship was both possible and necessary. The fringe interpretations, however questionable their methodology, at least take seriously the strangeness of what the ancient texts actually claim, rather than immediately translating that strangeness into modern categories that may fit poorly. Tonight, as sleep approaches and the boundary between waking and dreaming grows permeable, we might allow ourselves to wonder without demanding definitive answers, to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously the way ancient minds apparently could, to recognize that our ancestors were neither stupid primitives nor recipients of alien intervention, but complex humans making sense of experiences we may never fully understand. The Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were, have achieved a kind of immortality through the very tablets that recorded their deeds, surviving the civilizations that worshipped them, outlasting empires that never knew their names, reaching across millennia to find you here tonight, listening in the dark. If you've traveled this far through the night with me, perhaps you'll consider subscribing to join future journeys, each episode another doorway into deep time, where human experience takes unfamiliar forms that nonetheless illuminate our own moment. Let the old gods of Sumer guard your sleep, those Anunnaki who perhaps still linger somewhere in the collective memory of our species, encoded not in genes but in stories that refuse to die. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest restorative, and your morning gentle when it comes. The temple lamps gutter low in Eridu. Priests conclude their midnight rituals. Stars wheel above the ziggurat as they have for 5,000 years, and will for millions more, indifferent to human meaning but beautiful nonetheless. And you drift now towards sleep's ancient country where all stories merge and time loses its linearity. Good night, wherever you are in this spinning world. Whatever clock hands point at in your darkness, whatever questions you carry into sleep, the clay has spoken its secrets for tonight. End of script. Sweet dreams.